VCM has the potential to be a meaningful driver of decarbonization, but it's limited by an inefficient market mechanisms that underpin the scale, purchase, and retirement of voluntary carbon credits. And beyond the VCM, sustainability strategies are a bit hindered by a lack of transparency and data availability. There are many technical solutions that can be brought to bear, and I'm very excited to dive into this with the panel we have today, a panel of esteemed experts from across the spectrum of organizations that offer technology-based solution from one of the world's largest corporations, Google Cloud, to Patch, that has raised over $80 million to create the infrastructure for carbon market of the future, to Web3 innovators, Regen Network, and Filecoin Green. Thank you all for joining me. I'm going to introduce the panelists, and then I'll really let you guys speak a bit more, but I'll just run down quickly. So, Carlos Arena joins us from Google Cloud. Carlos is the Director of Digital Assets at Google Cloud, where he leads the business development and strategy for the digital assets team and blockchain ecosystem. Formerly, Carlos was the head of the global head of banking sales at R3, where he was responsible for the deployment of enterprise blockchain applications in regulated financial institutions. Ariel Hayward leads sustainability and carbon solutions at Patch, where she leverages her extensive carbon market expertise to guide project selection and advise companies on optimizing their climate goals. Before Patch, she contributed to soil carbon credit strategies at Carbon by Indigo, and was a consultant at Bain & Company. Marc Johnson is a driven sustainability leader working on technological solutions to problems facing the energy, water, food nexus. He has a master's in sustainability from Columbia University and holds credentials from both the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Scope 3 standard and Greenhouse Gas Protocol Mitigation Gold Standard. And finally, we have Gregory Landua, the co-founder of Regen Network, a community-owned and operated eco-credit registry and marketplace. Gregory currently hosts the Planetary Regeneration podcast. I'm excited to hear more about that. All right, so to dive in with some questions. Carlos, I'm going to start with you all the way over there. Some may be a bit surprised to learn that Google Cloud is investing heavily in Web3. For those unfamiliar with Web3, can you spend a few minutes sharing, for starters, what Web3 and blockchain are and why Google Cloud is so heavily focused on it?
Yeah, I will not get too technical in regards to blockchain or Web3, but for many, Web3 is synonymous with blockchain or cryptocurrency or a token. At Google Cloud, we believe that the definition is much broader. We believe there is a convergence of multiple technologies such as edge computing, multiple type of blockchain protocols, decentralized data networks, and even artificial intelligence that are coming together to create Web3. And the benefit of Web3 is that you will be able to both store and consume value and data in a decentralized manner. So for Google Cloud, this is just an evolution of the internet. 10 to 15 years ago, there was the open source development, and that really evolved the internet as to what it is today. We believe that Web3 will bring a similar type of evolution where instead of centralizing all data and consuming all data through centralized channels, we will have a new version of the internet where data and value will be stored in a decentralized manner. Google played a big role in Web 2, and we do believe that there's a big role for Google in Web 3. And in the future, we will just call it the web, the internet. We will just move back to what the internet is. It's just that it's not going to be the same internet that we have seen or are used to today. It's going to be a different type of internet, which, again, will be in a decentralized manner. Google is investing heavily in Web 3, and we have multiple areas where we're doing so. We have a Web3 engineering team that is building tooling and applications to basically remove the complexity of node hosting and also improving the ways that you consume and analyze blockchain data. In addition to that, we're first-party validators in multiple protocols. And we are incentivizing the ecosystem by providing cloud credits. So we want to be very, very active in regards to the overall ecosystem, providing 200,000 in cloud credits to those that are building applications on top of our platform. So big investment and a big focus as to what is the foundational layer for Web3, because we do believe that that's going to be integral to the evolution of the internet in the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, and I do agree, and I love to hear that will just be the internet, as opposed to this distinct new frontier. Marc, you are at the intersection of blockchain and technology sustainability with Filecoin Green. Can you share how you and Filecoin Green use blockchain to inject radical transparency and measurability into energy use and other emissions-related activities?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you for having me here as well. And I really like the way that you just framed that, Carlos, because, well, just to set the scene, Filecoin Green is an initiative of our parent company called Protocol Labs. Protocol Labs is an R&D lab that builds protocols and solutions for the next generation of the internet. 2 of those more prominent products are IPFS, the Interplanetary File System, and Filecoin. Filecoin's the world's largest decentralized data storage network. You can think of it as a decentralized Google Cloud, or like an Airbnb for cloud services. And it's approximately 24.5 exabytes of storage capacity, which is approximately like 90,000 copies of all of Wikipedia. It is a massive, massive network, and that collective storage capacity is contributed to the network by over 3,500 independent, small, modular data centers. And so, in recognition of the size and scale and growth projections of the Filecoin network, Protocol Labs created Filecoin Green to actively monitor the network energy use, the associated environmental impact, to help drive those and minimize those, and to, along the way, build tools and solutions to help better measure and monitor environmental impacts, not only within our own ecosystem, but across other networks and other forms of economic activity. So we do that in a myriad different ways, but the primary ways that we do it is monitoring the network energy use, connecting that to renewable energy, and working with those independent storage providers, those independent data centers, to help drive energy efficiency gains, to help deploy renewable energy on site or help them procure renewable energy, and to better measure and monitor their environmental impacts.
Greg, you can hear me, but I want everyone else to hear me. Zooming in on how blockchain can be used in the VCM specifically, Regen Network has been an early and vocal advocate of using blockchain technology as the foundational infrastructure for the voluntary carbon market and for registries that issue carbon credits, of which Regen is one of. Can you talk about why you've implemented the approach that you've had?
Yeah, well, let's start from the beginning. What are the things that we need to have a credible, liquid, viable carbon market? We need to have transparency, traceability. We need to have credibility, and we need to have consensus. So we need to have, we need to be able to wrangle complexity together as a community. And it turns out that centralized and bureaucratic institutions are remarkably poor at wrangling complexity in a community setting. So if we take a step back, carbon credits, we're monitoring and giving value to something that's a public good. So in a lot of ways, if you try to verify a public good using private servers and private algorithms and private data and private institutions, you see the erosion of credibility over time because there's always going to be parties who are excluded from that process. All right, so what does that have to do with blockchain? Well, generally, I mean, you can apply blockchain technology in many different ways, but one of the most popular ways is this idea of a public network, where you're actually creating consensus among a network of computers around both the programs that can be run and the data, primarily. And so what we at Regen Network believe is that this is actually the birth of a new institution type, right? A digitally native institution that allows all of the stakeholders who are required to do something like verify a claim about soil health or the biodiversity in a forest can come together to make that claim together at an extraordinarily high degree of rigor, transparency, and efficiency. I'll talk a little bit later about the role that governance plays in this, but it's just really important to understand the shift that we're seeing that's going to enable the types of voluntary carbon markets of the future require us to both reframe the process of crediting out of bureaucratic verification and into community verification, and to understand that this is a process, and the engine of that process is what we call, in a geeky way, an attestation network, right? That different counterparties are able to attest to the veracity of a specific claim or make a counterclaim, and that people can see that transparently. This allows us to price risk accurately if we're interested in the market side. It also allows us, if we're policymakers, to understand if actions are actually being taken and the impact that's being claimed has actually been achieved.
Things we all, I think, are somewhat aligned on. Beyond blockchain, so there's a whole universe of other technologies being brought to bear on the VCM. Ariel, Patch is creating a marketplace infrastructure that helps both buyers and sellers of credits navigate the carbon market. We've spoken a bit about how important trust is, that's what we're talking about, in this market. Can you speak about how Patch leverages best-in-class software and to build trust for buyers in the integrity of the credits that they purchase?
I think when we think about who is actually going to be funding these projects, all of the projects that we're using carbon credits to monetize and to fund, it's buyers, right? But those buyers are individual people. They're often ESG professionals. Carbon credit purchasing is one of the many hats that they wear, and it's maybe a few weeks, a month of their time every year. They're entering this market from a place of relative, in many cases, not all of course, but it's relatively nascent space for all of them. And when they Google it, they see a lot of articles criticizing it. Right? They're not necessarily getting at the heart of the ARR project that is really creating not only climate impact, but community outcomes. Right? And so one of the things that software, I think, does particularly well, I don't think by any means any of us up here are saying software can solve the climate crisis, but one of the things that software does particularly well is we start from a user experience design kind of foundational principle. It has to work for the user. It has to engage the user. Why do we love social media so much? It engages us, right? It is designed for us as human beings. And so how do we use software to bring that same level of engagement, understanding, transparency, and trust to our buyers, who at the end of the day are people looking to engage in a human way, looking to trust not only the thing that they are buying, but the people on the other side of that item, of that credit. Right? And so for us at Patch, that's really kind of the core ethos of how we think about all of our product development is how do we go to where the user is, whether that's the buyer for our purchasing products or our marketplace, or even our supplier partners using our Carbon OS products to manage their own inventory of credits. How do we go to where they are and build for them? Right? And I think as we think about blockchain use cases, as we think about AI, right? Maybe AI-assisted document review of a PDD. I don't know if you've ever tried to read a PDD, but it takes a while and it's generally pretty long. How do we use these technologies to make this market more accessible is one of the core questions that we're trying to answer.
I also saw recently that Patch has an API that sorry, I'll start that again. I recently saw that Patch has an API that enables corporates to actually integrate carbon credits into consumer purchases. And Deloitte came out with a report earlier this summer that projects $100 billion market for carbon credits just from consumer purchases. So one, I was really excited to see that. I'm curious if that's something that you're seeing as corporates are saying their consumers are asking for it, and what infrastructure needs to be built to facilitate consumer offsetting via corporates, via the purchases they're making, via the entities that they interact with.
Yeah, I think the software infrastructure itself in API is pretty straightforward, right? The ability to push that and pull that through in terms of buying and selling is not necessarily the thing that we're concerned about. We can do it, we are doing it. I think what we're seeing more in the market is consumers have similar questions to sustainability professionals. what should I be buying, first of all? Is this going to help the planet on a net basis? And if so, what should I be buying? How do I separate all these projects from one another? How do I sort through them, right? And so I think one of the main applications that is going to be really important for all of us here on the stage, all of us practitioners in the space to focus on is not, can that software infrastructure exist? It does, right? It's not crazy, but how do we make that software infrastructure desirable to folks to actually engage with? How do we make it as seamless as possible for a consumer to engage with, such that they are funneling dollars, channeling dollars into the projects that they care about? I think consumer engagement, potentially folks in this room have seen a bit of a softening in just consumer engagement with credits as we've seen more and more criticism of the space come into play, and they're saying, is this real? I read one article about it one time and I'm skeptical, right? That is the level of engagement we need to be addressing, is how do you get a consumer to understand the space enough where they can make an educated decision about the projects that they want to support. And I think that level of infrastructure around, now we're talking about project level details. Saplings went in the ground in this project on this day. That's really cool, you can report on that, right? And you need a really large data set to be able to talk about things at that level for every single project in the world that's being monetized through carbon credits. And so I think that's really where the focus is shifting, at least as far as we see it, is project level details and diligence. So how do we use things like AI to assist with document review, assist with things like generating an ESG report. Most ESG reports have roughly the same components. Do you really need to write it from scratch every single year? Probably not. Like, how do you make this whole world easier to engage with using the tools that we have, and not focusing on the tools necessarily as much as the outcomes and the means that we're pushing for?
Yeah, well, you brought up an interesting point that we talked a little bit about this earlier, but both carbon credits and Web3 are experiencing a similar thing, where there was a lot of enthusiasm and excitement, and then there was a little bit of a pullback from both. And so I'm curious, really from all of you, to hear your perspectives on what that means for the products and the products that are being produced at the intersection. So Greg, you might be a good person to lead with this, but there's certainly, when we first met, there was a lot of enthusiasm about both. And now there is some trepidation, and what can be done, or what is the education needed to alleviate some of the concerns that exist right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, so yeah, we're definitely in I think a moment of questioning both markets. Consumers and institutions are both questioning markets. I think that's actually a really healthy process, ultimately. On many levels. So I think we need to show our work. We need to show it working. For us, that means creating an innovative space for credit creators to both go through the process of making unparalleled new credits, right, that have transparency and impact, and making it very efficient to connect those credits to buyers. And actually what we're seeing, although there's sort of a general sense of pullback, we're also seeing a lot of the most innovative and exciting credits coming through our platform never actually make it to the market because they're getting pre-purchased, right? Because one of the interesting things that's happening, I believe, is I don't think there's any fundamental crisis of faith that the climate crisis is real, right? And I don't think there's any fundamental crisis in faith that information technology is real and important, right? So there's sort of, there's the superficial hype element of this, I think, is being rightfully questioned a little bit. Is this way of approaching carbon credits the way that we need to move forward? Is this way of hyping sort of community blockchain networks the right way to move forward, or tokenizing things? But if we ask those questions honestly and we dig a little bit deeper, we find something that is very substantive and powerful. And I think these are the market conditions in which real innovation and partnerships and impact really grow deep taproots, and something amazing can come out of it.
Yeah, and that's a theme we hear a lot, that this is the time for really building. Carlos, is that something that you're seeing at Google Cloud?
Adding to that, one of the key metrics that we follow is developer adoption, and the metrics of where we were in 2018 to where we are today, both for newcomers into Web3 development, but also established Web3 developers. We continue to see more and more developers, and that for us is a key metric, given that it continues to add innovation both on the technology and also on the product side. And we have not seen, definitely there was a contraction of the newbies or the people that had just joined or have been posting commits into code for less than a year. But those that have been 2 years and plus, we have seen continued growth in regards to developer adoption. The other thing too, I think there's been, there's always been a flourishment of new ideas and new companies. But I'm finally beginning to see institutional adoption, which I think is something that was required and needed. And for that, we need to have reliable, secure solutions, not net new, that have not been tested. So I think we have gone through a period where we needed to prove that reliability, that scalability, and that the products and services are secure. To actually tap into institutional funds and institutional managers that were required to not only sell to Web3 community, but outside of the Web3 community into institutional and or enterprises.
Yeah. Marc, a question for you. So there's a significant amount of regulatory momentum behind requiring enhanced transparency of Scope 3 emissions for corporates. Can you talk about what you foresee over the coming months that would drive accelerated adoption of the types of transformative tools you're building?
Yeah, certainly. And yeah, there is a tremendous amount of momentum happening in the regulatory space, especially as it applies to Scope 3, but also Scope 1 and Scope 2. And I guess bear with me while we go down like an acronym alley real quick, but in the EU, there's the CSDR, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. That is the first of its kind of social environmental set of rules that will ask registered companies to take into account the double materiality of their operations, what effect they are having or what impact they are having on the environment, and what impact the ever-changing environment may have on their own operations. That set of rules will require all the registered companies, which I believe is up to 50,000 companies worldwide, to account for Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. And the amazing thing about requiring those type of companies to account for Scope 3 emissions means that they will then force all of their value chain partners to report their Scope 1 and Scope 2. Because anybody's Scope 3 is invariably someone else's Scope 1 or Scope 2. So the mycelial network effects of these type of regulations are profound. And that's just within the EU. There's also CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, that's coming into effect in the EU. And then of course back here on the state side, we've got these pending SEC proposals, which hopefully they will actually announce something next month after several delays. And then of course out of California, you guys have heard all the buzz about SB 253 and 261, which are also related to Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 reporting. That's supposed to require like 5,600 companies to report that, which then will have those mycelial network effects of having even more companies report their Scope 1 and Scope 2. So a lot of momentum, a lot of exciting stuff, and it's still the early stages. We're going to continue to see broader adoption of these type of rules around the world.
First of all, incredibly impressed by your command of the acronyms. No small feat. Once there are regulations in place, I think this leads to technology adoption for really everybody's products, right? And so I'm curious if everybody could just go down. I'll let each panelist take this question, but in particular, what sort of broad adoption looks like of those products, and who utilizes these tools and technologies, especially when we think about Web3 integrating into more traditional corporates.
Shall I go first?
Please do.
Yeah, so adoption. What adoption looks like for us is a credit creator economy matched to specific, very specific corporate and societal goals and needs. So we really believe that The idea of sort of the universally fungible carbon credit that covers everybody's needs is a myth. And that instead we need to understand that there are specific, corporate impacts that need specific credit types. And so what we're innovating and what we're seeing adopted ever more is this really beautiful matching system. And so I think what we see on our side as adoption really is adoption of credit creators. And so Verra, for instance, who was up here on stage talking about water earlier today, and many other creditors who are creating new crediting systems are coming to us to innovate those new standards and create new transparency. And the opportunity to match those with buyers who have very specific regional outcomes because of new reporting requirements, I think is going to be extraordinarily profound.
Yeah.
To me?
Sure.
Sure, wonderful. Yeah, to us as a decentralized data storage network, adoption is happening so incredibly fast. I mentioned earlier, right now the Filecoin network is just shy of 25 ebibytes of quality adjusted power, or storage capacity, excuse me. That's a tremendous amount of storage capacity. That's close to maybe 10 or 12% of Google. And we launched 2.5 years ago. So the growth projections of our network are profound. I mean, we have data sets from NASA, from CERN, from UC Berkeley, from Stanford, like huge data sets coming on there all the time. Some of those data sets, actually specifically New York City's public data, is on there. And we've been working with policymakers to help inform them based on the insights that we can derive from these data sets. And the unique aspect of Filecoin specifically, and I mentioned IPFS earlier, is that all this data is content addressed, meaning that as it changes state throughout its life cycle, there's kind of an end-to-end audit trail of those state changes that are made to that data over time. And that really allows you to derive these new insights on what's happening and how it's connected to, say, some of these assets. So from an adoption perspective, we are very excited about what the future holds. We are working as tirelessly as we can to continue to monitor, measure, and drive that network impact or environmental impact to zero and past that. And we're excited to continue to collaborate with people such as Gregory, such as Patch, such as Google, and such as many others in the room to achieve those objectives.
It's exciting.
And of course, Flow. Sorry.
I might take it in a slightly different direction. In terms of adoption, where I'll just talk about adoption of carbon credits or voluntary carbon credits more broadly, enabled by technology, right? Like if we just look at the math, we are so far away from where we need to be in terms of project scale. And I want to talk about projects themselves because the credit is the thing that we often spend most of our time talking about, but what that actually is going towards is these projects. And how do we scale these projects is ultimately the question that all of us up here, all of us in the room are trying to figure out a way to do and to answer. And I think technology-enabled adoption of carbon credits or the voluntary carbon market in general, it relies on a few things. One is technological adoption for MRV purposes, right? Like you see a lot of the work that a lot of projects themselves are doing around tech-based MRV, but then you also see the work of folks like Pachama, like B0, Verra, Trove, folks in the room, right, around how do you implement GIS and help us get a better sense for what's actually happening in these projects today and in time. There's that adoption piece. If you think about it from a buyer story perspective, there's a buyer who's today is trying to figure out which credits to purchase, and that'll be enabled by technology that allows them to sort through projects and understand all of this detail and understand a PDD in much more detail than they can today. But it also requires management of that portfolio of credits ongoing, right? If you are a buyer and you sign an offtake agreement today for 10 years into the future, you need to know what's happening with that project at every step in that project's life cycle. So that software-enabled use case around, I have a portfolio of credits and now I need to figure out when they're going to be retired, when they're issuing, if they're delayed, how does this look so that when I think about reporting, when I think about regulation, when I think about an auditor eventually stepping in and going through all of this, it's all in one place and we're actually following standards that have already been set around best-in-class software and software auditing, right? So I think adoption for us looks like a lot of different things, but the goal at the end of the day is adoption of these projects via carbon credits. And so like that's kind of what we should all probably want to stay focused on is how do we make this broader goal come to life?
Yeah.
I'll just add, in regards to the technology piece, there's things that had to be solved in regards to throughput, in regards to gas fees, in regards to the complexity of running and deploying nodes, or just the infrastructure that is necessary for us to, to run a blockchain network. And those are being solved. I think the next step is we continue to have assets and applications and marketplaces in different silos. So the interoperability that needs to happen across them, and the ongoing complexity of new protocols that come out that will potentially bridge one or two or all of them, is something that still needs to be just fixed in a way of reducing complexity for you to deploy, and for you to be able to tap assets that will not be in one single protocol, one application, and one single marketplace. We will have different protocols for different type of use cases, and for doing so, you will have to have interoperability and connections between multiple networks. And it will happen. It's still a little, there's friction in today's market.
So I had a question related to what Ariel said, and now I have a different question related to what Carlos just said. But I'll start with my question related to Ariel, because it's a question for Carlos, which is, when we think about the adoption of carbon credits, something that we've talked about a lot in the Web3 space is the tokenization of carbon credits. And I'm curious how Google views the tokenization of real-world assets, or just assets generally, and how, if there's any perspective on the adoption of that in particular. That is a conversation we've been engaging in for some time, and is sort of the blending of adopting some Web3 technology and as well as carbon credits themselves.
In regards to tokenization on our end, Google Cloud is not necessarily building the tokenization platform. We're just building the infrastructure for those to build on top of it. What we want to do is provide a platform where building and deploying an application on Google Cloud is what you want to do, and the best way to deploy it, but also to extract and analyze the data that will come out of that. So providing tools for data consumption and data analytics, which is really, really important. Lastly, we also we want to be part of the ecosystem. We understand that it's not the protocol, not the application, but it's the users. So how do we incentivize the users to actually deploy and have the necessary infrastructure to actually become a participant in these networks? So that's how Google is thinking about tokenization, not just by providing the infrastructure, but also by aiding those companies that will be part of the tokenization as users, and just bringing them into the network itself.
A question that, all of these are related topics, but you spoke a bit about interoperability. And Regen Network is a different kind of standards body, if you will. I'm curious if interoperability plays into that, or how having a decentralized governance network sets you apart, or is a distinguishing factor.
Yeah, that's so many questions, but it's really at the heart of all of this, right? Which is, and we don't have a huge amount of time, but I want to discern between technical interoperability and, I don't know, maybe the interoperability of standards. And so from a technical perspective, we are very passionate about interoperability, and that's part of why we've made the tech decisions that we have to be interoperability centric, where there's this idea. In order for the decentralized technology that we're talking about to really fuel a different internet and a different carbon market, interoperability is key, because to the degree to which we have silos and that network effect is defensible via maintaining silos, we actually won't get the information efficiency that I think we all believe needs to happen in order for this to work. Okay, so now let's talk about standards, because I think, so our approach has always been that we would like to have a plurality of standards, and in fact, we would like to make it easier to iterate and innovate new standards, right? But also to be able to reconcile standards and potentially index them or search between them and understand if they match. So I think in order to understand my perspective about standards interoperability, we need to think about like a taxonomy or a hierarchy or levels, where there are certain accounting standards for carbon markets that absolutely have to come from the top down. These have to be, but those processes require political processes, and this is Paris. This is the Paris Agreement. These are the things. We need to be pushing information into that, but you also can't wait for it. So we also have to be taking impact now. And if you want to take impact now, you need to put the power, you need to push power out to the edges where impact can be taken quickly and effectively. And that's putting power into the hands of community members, right? So if you want to do a local climate action, who better to implement it and verify that it's actually taken place but local project developers and stakeholders and community members. And so by being able to encourage and engage people who are on the ground taking climate action to reforest or to change agricultural practices or to change business practices, and to be able to allow them to innovate quickly and match cutting-edge science with the type of claims they're making and build more local market relationships, we can radically accelerate our climate action. We can also be working to reconcile those claims into the larger nested jurisdictional and global carbon accounting system. That is a little hard, but it isn't impossible. And what's nice about not waiting and pushing power out to the edge is that we can actually plausibly make the leaps in climate action that the world is demanding of us now.
I might just add to that the dimension of financial and accounting interoperability as well for corporates, right? Like if you're a corporate trying to make this decision, you're going through a budget cycle, you've got to figure out when you're going to purchase, you might actually be able to make an investment, right? But what you're actually getting in return needs to be able to square with the rest of your books. How are you actually going to account for this on your balance sheet, on your P&L? What are you thinking about in that way? And so even on just a much more micro level, getting the accounting standards stood up around this, like how you report around this and what you do with it, and that, that opens the door to things like, can you actually capitalize this expense? And once you can do that, there's a lot more CFOs whose ears will perk up and say like, oh, that's kind of interesting, maybe we'll think about that, right? And so this concept of really fitting what we are trying to do into the context of the financials that any of our buyers are going to need to square is really critically important, and I don't think we've quite cracked that one yet.
Yeah, I think that's a theme we hear a lot when we're talking outside of sort of this room and we're working with corporates. That is definitely a theme we hear over and over again. I know we really are at time, but I want to ask just one final question, which is, this is the Blockchain, AI, and More panel. We haven't really touched much on AI, but are there other transformative technologies that you think are exciting or already in development that would catapult the climate, all of the climate effort or the carbon markets most specifically? I'll just let you run down and do it, and we'll start here with Greg.
Yeah. I mean, Earth observation, the coming, and it's all connected. It's all connected. You can't sort of rip one thing out, because also that's connected to AI and machine learning and data availability and semantic data, and all of these things converge to give us the capability to have an emerging real-time capability to monitor ecological health, the living carbon cycle, and to commit to goals and create new instruments that value what we need to take, what needs to take place, right? So I would pick probably some of the I'm really excited about what Planet Labs is going to be launching here shortly. Their planetary variable systems, where they're basically going to be not just serving up the day-to-day data feed of the entire planet, but actually making sense of that and being able to do real-time biomass and biodiversity monitoring at a planetary scale, I think is going to be transformational for how the market formation works in the future.
Second that. I think what Planet Labs and other companies in that space are doing is profound, and We're obviously at the very, very early stages of understanding the potential impacts in value adds of what all of these innovative transformative technologies can unlock when they're combined in certain ways. But also with regard to AI and these other, new enhanced ML applications and things like that, since this is an environmental conversation, we also need to recognize and continue to monitor the environmental impact that these are creating. I mean, there was a recent article, I believe, in Fortune, where it stated flat out that every time you send a query into ChatGPT, the model underlining it consumes something like 18 ounces of water. That is an insane amount of water when there's a few 100 million people around the world sending queries continuously. Don't hold me to that. I don't know that that is actually factually correct, but the environmental impact of these AI models, of these LLMs, is a lot. It's likely a lot more than all of the Web3 crypto platforms combined, plus a few factors, and so we do need to recognize that.
Yeah, sounds very hydrated.
I'll speak briefly about kind of some of the hardware solutions. We talked a lot about software-based solutions, and especially we at Patch focus a lot on that. But I think in the removal space, but also in some of these blended kind of reduction and avoidance states, you see a lot of really interesting hardware, and even just not even technology per se, like net new innovation, but something like addressing old technologies. Like if we're thinking about a project that needs to cap old oil and gas wells to keep that methane from being emitted, because that is what has been happening for the last however many years, that's really interesting. And the way that folks are going about that in more efficient manners, like you're actually developing net new tools and hardware that you can take out into a field much more accessibly, things like that. I think all of these small, even if they seem small scale, kind of net new breakthroughs in terms of how to make things lighter, how to actually get out in the field more easily, how to make MRV a lot simpler, soil sampling, for example. Like how do you make all of these processes that make the quantification and verification of all of these processes work much better and much more simply at lower cost? I think that that suite of products is something that it's probably talked about a bit less.
Yeah. And lastly, I'll just add code augmentation. So instead of becoming, a full-fledged expert in a specific protocol, you'll be able to have augmentation, and even, you will be able to test the vulnerabilities of the code that you're writing, and it's just going to be much more efficient and quicker for you to develop. So it's now available, and it's super, super exciting to see. Like autocorrect, autofill, like those things that you're used to just typing into an email, imagine that for coding. It's really cool.
Yeah, exciting stuff. Well, thank you all for joining us.